The neighborhood of Westfield, New Jersey in the early 1970s could have been lifted from a postcard. Rows of tidy colonial-style homes lined the streets, each trimmed with hedges and freshly painted shutters. Children pedaled their bikes across cul-de-sacs, dogs barked behind fences, and neighbors waved to one another with the kind of effortless politeness only found in the suburbs. On Hillside Avenue, one particular home stood tall, a mansion of stone and gables that whispered wealth, stability, and pride. To those who passed by, the List residence was immaculate, its windows polished, its lawn manicured with precision. It looked like the home of a man who had mastered life, a patriarch who kept his world in order. Inside, however, order was only a performance, and the cracks in the picture-perfect facade were already forming. John List, the man of the house, carried himself with the stiff, upright posture of a soldier still marching in time. He wore his suit every morning, polished his shoes until they reflected the light, and stepped out as though heading to work. Neighbors would nod and smile, believing he was commuting to his accounting job in the city. None of them knew that his briefcase contained only yesterday's newspapers, that his footsteps led not to an office but to train stations and public benches where he lingered, hiding the truth. He had been unemployed for weeks. Still, the illusion mattered. For John, appearance was more than pride. It was survival. His faith, his upbringing, his self-worth all demanded that he be the provider, the guardian of both reputation and soul. A man who failed in that role was not just unsuccessful, he was sinful. At the breakfast table, his wife, Helen, sipped her coffee in silence, her eyes weary. She glanced at him, suspicion flickering, but said nothing. John caught her gaze, tightened his jaw, and adjusted his tie. "Shy!" "You'll be late," she murmured. "I won't," he replied firmly, his tone closing the subject. The clink of cutlery echoed too loudly in the room. Their daughter Patricia entered, books clutched to her chest, her youthful face shadowed by dreams she dared not share with her father. She kissed her mother's cheek and avoided John's eyes. "Don't forget rehearsal after school," Helen reminded her gently. John's brow twitched. "Rehearsal for what?" Patricia hesitated. "The play. We're performing in December." "Plays," John muttered, lowering his paper. "Foolish distractions. Your studies should come first." Patricia looked down, swallowing her protest. Silence returned to the table, heavy and brittle. Outside, the sun shone across the neighborhood, catching the gleam of white fences and green lawns. Children's laughter carried faintly through the windows, a stark contrast to the tension inside the grand house. Narration lingers here on the truth unseen by outsiders, that the List family was far from the idyllic picture painted by their address. Helen's illness, Patricia's ambitions, the boy's quiet rebellion, each thread pulled tighter against John's rigid expectations. Yet for now, no one beyond the front door could sense it. Neighbors would later describe the house as cold, unwelcoming, a place where curtains were always drawn too tightly. But in this moment, it looked like stability incarnate. The facade remained unbroken. As John kissed his wife on the cheek and stepped out the door, his polished shoes striking the stone pathway, he gave the same wave to the neighbor across the street. A wave that said, "All is well. My family is perfect. My life is in order." The neighbor waved back, unsuspecting, before turning away. And so the illusion held for one more day. But inside John's mind, the performance was already slipping. The shadows of failure and doubt grew sharper, pressing against the carefully built mask. Soon, the weight would become unbearable. And with that weight, the first cracks in the List family's portrait would begin to show. John List walked away from his home with his usual brisk stride, but every step felt heavier than the polished shoes suggested. To his neighbors, he was the image of a disciplined man on his way to work. To John himself, he was a hollow vessel, trapped in a lie he could not escape. The act of pretending to be employed was not just exhausting, it was suffocating. The train station became his stage. Each morning he purchased a ticket, sat stiffly on a bench, and unfolded his newspaper. Hours passed in silence. He traced headlines he had already read, circled classified ads he could not answer, and stared at strangers who moved with purpose while he remained paralyzed. By evening, he returned home as if nothing were wrong, slipping back into the role of provider. Pride was his prison. Asking for help would mean admitting weakness. To John, weakness was sin, and sin meant eternal failure. He had been raised on discipline, on duty, on the certainty that a man's worth was measured by what he provided. The idea of telling Helen, or even the children, the truth of his unemployment was unthinkable. At dinner one night, Helen glanced across the table, her eyes narrowing. The meal sat untouched before her, a cigarette burning idly in her hand. "John," she said softly, "you seem distracted lately. Is everything all right at the office?" John tightened his grip on the fork, his knuckles pale. "Everything is fine," he said sharply. Patricia looked up from her plate, sensing the tension but saying nothing. The boys exchanged glances, quiet, uncertain. Helen pressed. "You leave earlier than before, and yet you seem more tired when you return." His voice rose, brittle and controlled. "I said everything is fine. Do not question me on this." The table fell silent. Helen lowered her eyes, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. Narration carried the truth. Beneath John's stern words, panic simmered. His savings were dwindling. Bills piled on the desk he kept locked. The grand house he had purchased to elevate his family's standing was now a weight dragging him into despair. Even his faith, once a source of comfort, twisted into judgment. Every prayer he whispered felt like condemnation. At night, he paced the darkened rooms. The echoes of footsteps across polished wood were his only companions. He would pause before the cross hanging on the wall, staring at it with hollow eyes. "Why test me this way?" he thought. "Why me? Make me carry this shame alone." Sometimes Helen's cough would drift from the bedroom, reminding him of her worsening health. She was fragile, withdrawn, bitter from years of disappointment. To John, her illness felt like another reminder of his inadequacy. Instead of sympathy, he harbored quiet resentment. Resentment he buried behind scripture and silence. One evening, as he stood at the window, Patricia approached cautiously. "Dad," she whispered, "I was thinking of auditioning for a role at the community theater. It could lead to something bigger." John's jaw clenched. "Acting is not a future, Patricia. It is vanity and corruption. Focus on your studies. Don't waste yourself." Her shoulders sank, and she retreated without another word. John turned back to the glass, staring into the darkness outside. Yet deep inside, fear gnawed at him. Fear of losing control, of failing not just as a father, but as a man of God. The narration lingered on his inner struggle. The father's burden was not only financial, but spiritual. He believed he was failing to protect his family from both earthly ruin and eternal damnation. And as those fears grew, so too did the seeds of an idea he had not yet dared to name. Still, the facade held, for now. The children continued their routines. Helen drifted through her haze of illness, and the house remained immaculate to the outside world. But the cracks had begun to form, and soon they would spread across every corner of the List family portrait. The weight pressing on John List's shoulders seeped into the walls of his home, reshaping the atmosphere until it no longer felt like a sanctuary but a prison. What had once been a family portrait of order and stability now revealed hairline fractures. Small arguments sharpened into silences. Shared meals became battlegrounds of unspoken resentment, punctuated by cigarettes and pills that blurred the edges of her reality. The illness she carried left her fragile, but her bitterness Helen drifted further into her haze. Her once vibrant presence had dulled into apathy. Her days left her sharp. John saw her as both victim and burden, the wife he could neither heal nor escape. At the dining table one evening, the silence was broken by Patricia's hesitant voice. "Dad, our teacher says I have talent. She thinks I should pursue theater after high school." John lowered his utensils with deliberate calm, though his temples pulsed. "We've spoken of this. Acting is not a path for a Christian. It leads to sin." Patricia's lips trembled, but she pressed on. "It's not sinful to want a future that makes me happy. Why is everything I dream of wrong in your eyes?" Helen coughed, her laugh dry and bitter. "Let the girl dream, John. Not everyone can live by your rigid rules." His glare cut across the table. "Enough, Helen." The air thickened. Patricia stared down at her plate, blinking back tears, while the boys sat frozen in uneasy silence. John's control over the family was slipping, and he felt it. Narration revealed the deeper truth. The children were no longer simply obedient extensions of their father's will. They were growing, resisting, carving identities that John viewed as rebellion. His authority, once absolute, eroded with each sigh, each unanswered command. Frederick had begun spending long afternoons with friends, hiding his interests from his father. John Jr., once eager to impress him, now questioned his every word. And Patricia's defiance struck the deepest wound, for in her he saw both potential and the corruption of a world he feared. In quiet moments, John walked through the house, inspecting it as though its order could restore his own. He polished the wood, checked the locks, adjusted the curtains. Yet even why thin these rituals, he felt the emptiness growing. The house was grand but hollow, filled with whispers of dissatisfaction that no prayer seemed to silence. One night, Helen confronted him directly. "You think you're saving us by pretending everything is fine, but John, your pride is choking this family." He turned from her, his jaw tight. "Pride? No. Duty. I carry what you cannot." Her voice broke. "And what does it cost us? You demand obedience, but you give us no warmth, no love." John said nothing. In his silence, Helen saw the wall he built around himself, a wall fortified by scripture, shame, and fear. Narration pressed in. John's world was unraveling, and he clung harder to control, mistaking it for salvation. Each fracture in his family's portrait was, to him, a threat to their souls. The more they pulled away, the more he believed it was his sacred duty to hold them in place. The List home remained immaculate to neighbors' eyes, curtains drawn, lawn perfect, facade unbroken. But behind those curtains, voices clashed, dreams were stifled, and hope dimmed. And in John's mind, the whispers of failure twisted into something else, a conviction that the family's salvation would not come from compromise or compassion, but from a sacrifice only he could deliver. The thought had not yet solidified into action, but its shadow lingered. Soon, faith and madness would blur, and John would decide that God's will demanded more than discipline, it demanded blood. John List's world had narrowed into a suffocating corridor of scripture, silence, and shadows. The cracks in his family no longer felt like ordinary struggles. To him, they were signs of spiritual decay. Each cough from Helen, each defiant glance from Patricia, each subtle act of independence from his sons gnawed at his conviction that his home was slipping away from God's path. Night after night, he sat at the long dining room table with his Bible spread before him. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting sharp lines across his face. The words of judgment, sin, and salvation leapt from the pages, lodging in his mind like nails. Verses he once found comforting now felt like commands. Orders delivered from a divine authority he could neither question nor escape. In the solitude of prayer, his whispers grew darker. "Lord, guide me. If I cannot save them in life, then let me save them in death. Let me bring them to you before the world takes them away." The silence that followed was not an answer, but an echo. Still, John convinced himself that God was listening. that the weight he felt pressing on his chest was not madness, but divine instruction. During the day, he watched his children with haunted eyes. Patricia rehearsed in secret, but John found the scripts she hid in her room. He burned them in the fireplace, the ash curling upward like lost dreams. Frederick came home late more often, and John Jr. grew bolder in questioning his authority. One evening, John confronted his eldest son. "You mock me with your disobedience," he said, voice tight with restrained fury. John Jr. stared back, unflinching. "I don't mock you. I just don't believe God wants us to live in fear." The words struck harder than any blow. To John, it was not rebellion against a father, but against God himself. His hands trembled, but he said nothing more, retreating into his silent fortress of Scripture. Narration carried the spiral. John began to interpret every act of defiance as proof that the devil's influence had infiltrated his home. Helen's bitterness, Patricia's ambitions, the boy's independence, these were no longer human flaws but spiritual corruption. He told himself he had been chosen to act, that God had placed him as guardian of their souls. The description of the house reflected his inner dissent. The curtains stayed drawn tighter, rooms fell into disuse, and the air grew heavy with unease. Where others might have seen a family struggling, John saw a battlefield between heaven and hell. And he believed himself to be the general, armed with righteousness and a revolver locked in his desk. Helen noticed his growing detachment. One night she confronted him as he sat reading. "You're not saving us, John. You're losing yourself. I barely recognize the man I married." He didn't look up. "You lost faith long ago. If I falter, the children will be damned with you." Her voice broke. "You talk as if you're God himself." At that he turned, his face stern, eyes blazing with a conviction that chilled her. "No, I am his servant, and servants must obey." Narration deepened. Whether this was devotion or madness no longer mattered, for in John's mind the two had become inseparable. His prayers blurred into plans. He withdrew money quietly, calculated the timing of his children's routines, and began shaping the idea of a final act, not of anger, but of mercy as he understood it. The days ahead grew quieter, more deliberate. John's footsteps in the house slowed, his gaze lingered longer, his movements sharpened with precision. He was not rushing. He was preparing. And in that stillness, the house itself seemed to sense what was coming. The stage was being set, detail by detail, for an unthinkable act. Soon, the storm would arrive. Silent, deliberate, and devastating. The decision was no longer abstract. It had taken root, deep and immovable, within John List's mind. What began as whispers in prayer had hardened into certainty. God required him to act. The days leading up to that act became unnervingly calm, as though the house itself held its breath. John's preparations were meticulous, carried out with the precision of a man trained to leave nothing undone. In the attic, he found his old revolver and a rifle, polishing them until the metal gleamed under the dim light. He purchased ammunition quietly, folding the receipt into his wallet with a trembling hand. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Inside, each detail was being arranged with chilling patience. Narration lingered on his steps, withdrawing cash from the bank, calculating the mortgage payments, ensuring the family's affairs would not unravel in chaos. He wrote letters to schools, to employers, even to relatives, explaining that the family was leaving on an extended trip. Very lie was crafted to buy him time. At night, he rehearsed in silence. He walked through the house, room by room, imagining the sequence. Who would be first? How he would move? Where he would place each body? His breaths grew slower with each rehearsal, his resolve colder. One evening, Patricia noticed the tension. She paused in the hallway, watching her father's silhouette framed against the study lamp.
"Dad,"
she asked softly,
"are you all right? You don't sleep anymore."
He turned, forcing a calm smile. "I'm fine, Patricia. Just thinking about the future." Her brows knit with unease.
"You scare me sometimes. You look at us like you're somewhere else."
John's eyes softened, though his voice carried finality. "I'm only thinking about what's best for you. One day, you'll understand." The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered. Description captured the house in those days. Curtains drawn, clocks ticking too loudly in the silence, meals eaten without conversation. Even the air seemed still, as though waiting. Helen's cough echoed in the quiet halls. Patricia scribbled lines of plays she dared not share. The boys retreated into their rooms. Yet John moved among them with a ghostly composure, detached but ever present. The pastor's voice haunted him in memory, sermons about judgment and salvation replaying in his mind. John returned to the Bible nightly, underlining verses that spoke of sacrifice, cleansing, and eternal life. The words blurred into justification, feeding the belief that his family's souls could only be secured through his hands. Helen confronted him once more.
"You've become a stranger in this house, John. Whatever you're planning, stop before it destroys us all."
His reply was measured, almost tender. "It won't destroy us, Helen. It will save us." She stared at him, unnerved, but said nothing more. Perhaps she was too weary to fight. Perhaps she no longer believed he was capable of change. Narration tightened. The storm was not sudden. It built slowly, with each quiet step, each calculated act of preparation. John's mind no longer wrestled with doubt, only with timing. He needed the right day, the right hour, the right sequence to fulfill what he believed was divine command. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, the air in Westfield carried the crisp chill of approaching winter. Neighbors bustled about their routines, children hurried to school, and the list home appeared as silent and proper as always. Inside, John adjusted his tie, set his briefcase aside, and opened the drawer where the revolver waited. The moment he had rehearsed countless times had arrived. The quiet was ending. The first shot was coming. The morning of November 9th, 1971 began with the deceptive calm John List had engineered. Sunlight cut through the blinds in narrow stripes, casting quiet patterns across the kitchen floor. Helen sat at the breakfast table, her hand trembling as she lifted a cup of coffee to her lips. John moved behind her with calculated stillness, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression unreadable. Narration slowed the moment. Years of bitterness, disappointment, and resentment condensed into the air between them. To John, this was not murder. It was release. He had convinced himself it was God's will, an act of salvation. His hand reached for the revolver concealed in his jacket pocket. "John?" Helen asked, her voice weary, uncertain. He answered not with words, but with the sharp crack of a gunshot. His sound tore through the house, echoing against walls that had contained decades of silence. Helen slumped instantly, her coffee spilling in a dark bloom across the table. John stood motionless, staring at her still form. For a brief second, doubt flickered, then hardened into resolve. One life had ended, but in his mind, 5 souls remained to be saved. Narration pressed forward. His mother, Alma, waited upstairs in her private apartment. John climbed the staircase with deliberate steps, the revolver heavy but steady in his grip. The house was unnervingly quiet, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Alma looked up from her chair as he entered, her aged face softening into a smile.
"John, what was that noise?"
He forced calm into his voice. Just something falling downstairs, Mother. Nothing to worry about. She nodded, trusting. In that moment, John's heart twisted, but his hand did not hesitate. He raised the revolver and fired once. The shot was quick, merciful in his eyes. Alma slumped sideways, her rosary sliding from her fingers. Description captured the stark contrast. The scent of coffee still lingered downstairs, while upstairs the faint trace of lavender powder mixed with gun smoke. 2 lives extinguished, 2 bodies silent. Yet John's movements remained composed, his breathing even. He returned to the kitchen, wiping his hands with methodical care. Helen's body lay slumped, her face turned away. John dragged her onto a sleeping bag he had placed earlier, his motions cold, efficient. He arranged her carefully, almost reverently, as though preparing her for a journey. Narration deepened. The act no longer felt like crime. It had become ritual. Each movement reinforced his conviction that this was not madness, but mission. He turned off lights in unused rooms, pulled curtains tighter, and checked the clock. Soon the children would return from school. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the silence inside the house thickened. Outside, neighbors carried on with their routines, utterly unaware. Inside, death lingered in the walls, waiting for the next arrivals. John sat at the dining table, revolver resting on the wood, his Bible beside it. He read passages in low murmurs, pausing only to glance toward the door. When Patricia arrived home first, her footsteps echoed in the hall. She called out, "Mom? Dad?" but received no reply. John rose slowly, his hand brushing the revolver. "Dad?" she asked again, stepping into the kitchen. John's voice was calm, almost soothing. "Come sit with me, Patricia. We need to talk." The chapter closed in tension, narration hovering over the unbearable weight of the moment, one child stepping unknowingly into the same fate as her mother and grandmother. The first shots had been fired, and the storm was far from over. Patricia hesitated in the kitchen doorway, her school bag slipping from her shoulder. The house was too still. Her father's presence, sitting rigidly at the dining table, Bible at his side and revolver half concealed beneath his hand, felt oppressive. She looked at him with suspicion, her instincts sharpened by months of tension in their home. "Where's Mom?" she asked, her voice soft, uncertain. John smiled faintly, but it was hollow. "She's resting. Come, Patricia, sit with me. We need to pray." Patricia's steps were slow, each one weighted with unease. She sat across from him, her eyes darting toward the kitchen counter, the floor, anywhere but his face. In her chest, her heart hammered. She knew something was wrong. Narration cut sharply. John saw her fear, and in it he saw weakness, the kind he believed he was saving her from. Without another word, he raised the revolver. The shot rang out, piercing the silence, and Patricia crumpled to the floor. Her young body, full of dreams she had only begun to articulate, was still. John dragged her carefully, laying her beside Helen on the sleeping bag. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling for the first time, yet his conviction held firm. He told himself she would thank him in heaven. The next to arrive was Frederick. He bounded into the house with the energy of youth, his voice calling, "Mom! Patty! I'm home!" The sound was jarring against the deathly stillness. John stepped from the shadows. "Fred, come here. We need to talk." Frederick frowned, sensing something amiss. "What's going on? Why are the curtains closed?" "Just come here, son," John said, his voice steady, almost gentle. Frederick obeyed reluctantly, his footsteps slow. John placed a hand on his shoulder, a fleeting gesture of fatherly affection, before pulling the revolver up against his chest. "Dad," Frederick began, but the word was cut short by a deafening crack. The boy fell, his youthful defiance extinguished in an instant. Narration lingered. The smell of gunpowder thickened in the air, mingling with the faint scent of Patricia's perfume and Helen's spilled coffee. 3 generations silenced, all within a span of hours. John felt his chest tighten, not with guilt, but with the weight of inevitability. Only John Jr. remained, his eldest son, the one he had once pinned his hopes upon, the one he believed most needed saving. John knew this moment would be the hardest. Evening shadows stretched across the walls when John Jr. finally arrived. The sound of the door closing echoed like a final note. He dropped his book, was on the table, calling out with a teenage casualness that pierced the silence.
Dad? Patty? Where is everyone?
John emerged from the kitchen, revolver hidden behind his back. Upstairs, resting. Come with me, son. We need to have a word. John Jr. paused, suspicion flickering across his face. Something's wrong, isn't it? For the first time, John faltered. His voice shook. It's better this way, son. Trust me. John Jr. saw the gun too late. He lunged toward his father, a surge of desperation and resistance. Unlike the others, he fought. The struggle was brutal, messy, filled with grunts and muffled cries. They toppled into a chair which crashed against the wall. John fired once. The bullet struck but did not fell him. John Jr. gasped, eyes wide with shock, yet he still clawed at his father's arm. "Dad, stop!" he cried, blood streaking his shirt. John pressed the revolver close, tears brimming though his face remained grim. "I have to, son. You'll understand. Someday." 2 more shots rang out, reverberating through the walls like thunder. John Jr. collapsed finally, his breathing shallow before ceasing altogether. Description painted the scene. John stood over his eldest boy, his hands shaking, sweat beading at his temples. The revolver slipped slightly in his grip, its steel smeared with fingerprints and traces of blood. Around him, silence reclaimed the house, a silence more suffocating than any sound. Narration settled into chilling finality. In less than 1 day, John List had annihilated his entire family, each act justified in his warped mind as divine mercy. The mansion in Westfield, once filled with laughter and music, now held only death. He moved their bodies, one by one, arranging them side by side in the ballroom. Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr., all laid with a strange reverence, as though they were still his family, simply sleeping. Alma, too frail to move, remained in her upstairs room. John stepped back to look at them, a twisted portrait of peace. Yet, beneath it all, shadows deepened. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of his escape. The chapter ended in silence, the silence of children who would never speak again, and the silence of a man who had convinced himself he was God's instrument. Patricia hesitated in the kitchen doorway, her school bag slipping from her shoulder. The house was too still. Her father's presence, sitting rigidly at the dining table, Bible at his side and revolver half concealed beneath his hand, felt oppressive. She looked at him with suspicion, her instincts sharpened by months of tension in their home.
Where's Mom?
She asked, her voice soft, uncertain. John smiled faintly, but it was hollow. She's resting. Come, Patricia. Sit with me. We need to pray. Patricia's steps were slow. Each one weighted with unease. She sat across from him, her eyes darting toward the kitchen counter, the floor, anywhere but his face. In her chest, her heart hammered. She knew something was wrong. Narration cut sharply. John saw her fear, and in it he saw weakness, the kind he believed he was saving her from. Without another word, he raised the revolver. The shot rang out, piercing the silence, and Patricia crumpled to the floor. Her young body, full of dreams she had only begun to articulate, was still. John dragged her carefully, laying her beside Helen on the sleeping bag. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling for the first time. Yet his conviction held firm. He told himself she would thank him in heaven. The next to arrive was Frederick. He bounded into the house with the energy of youth, his voice calling, "Mom! Patty! I'm home!" The sound was jarring against the deathly stillness. John stepped from the shadows. "Fred, come here. We need to talk." Frederick frowned, sensing something amiss. "What's going on? Why are the curtains closed?" "Just come here, son," John said, his voice steady, almost gentle. Frederick obeyed reluctantly, his footsteps slow. John placed a hand on his shoulder, a fleeting gesture of fatherly affection, before pulling the revolver up against his chest. "Dad," Frederick began, but the word was cut short by a deafening crack. The boy fell, his youthful defiance extinguished in an instant. Narration lingered. The smell of gunpowder thickened in the air, mingling with the faint scent of Patricia's perfume and Helen's spilled coffee. 3 generations silenced, all within a span of hours. John felt his chest tighten, not with guilt, but with the weight of inevitability. Only John Jr. remained. His eldest son, the one he had once pinned his hopes upon, the one he believed most needed saving. John knew this moment would be the hardest. Evening shadows stretched across the walls when John Jr. finally arrived. The sound of the door closing echoed like a final note. He dropped his books on the table, calling out with a teenage casualness that pierced the silence. "Dad? Patty? Where is everyone?" John emerged from the kitchen, revolver hidden behind his back. "Upstairs, resting. Come with me, son. We need to have a word." John Jr. paused, suspicion flickering across his face. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" For the first time, John faltered. His voice shook. "It's better this way, son. Trust me." John Jr. saw the gun too late. He lunged toward his father, a surge of desperation and resistance. Unlike the others, he fought. The struggle was brutal, messy, filled with grunts and muffled cries. They toppled into a chair, which crashed against the wall. John fired once. The bullet struck but did not fell him. John Jr. gasped, eyes wide with shock, yet he still clawed at his father's arm. "Dad, stop!" "Hey," he cried, blood streaking his shirt. John pressed the revolver close, tears brimming though his face remained grim. "I have to, son. You'll understand someday." 2 more shots rang out, reverberating through the walls like thunder. John Jr. collapsed finally, his breathing shallow before ceasing altogether. Description painted the scene. John stood over his eldest boy, his hands shaking, sweat beading at his temples. The revolver slipped slightly in his grip, its steel smeared with fingerprints and traces of blood. Around him, silence reclaimed the house, a silence more suffocating than any sound. Narration settled into chilling finality. In less than 1 day, John List had annihilated his entire family, each act justified in his warped mind as divine mercy. The mansion in Westfield, once filled with laughter and music, now held only death. He moved their bodies one by one, arranging them side by side in the ballroom. Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr., all laid with a strange reverence, as though they were still his family, simply sleeping. Alma, too frail to move, remained in her upstairs room. John stepped back to look at them, a twisted portrait of peace. Yet beneath it all, shadows deepened. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of his escape. The chapter ended in silence, the silence of children who would never speak again, and the silence of a man who had convinced himself he was God's instrument. It began with a faint suspicion, almost imperceptible. Neighbors noticed the curtains never opened, the mailbox overflowing, the swing in the yard unmoved. Days passed, and the quiet grew heavier. Westfield's tidy streets, once filled with children's laughter and the hum of daily life, now held a subtle unease, a sense that something had gone terribly wrong behind the doors of the List mansion. Narration lingered on the rising tension. Neighbors whispered, speculated, but no one dared enter. The perfect suburban facade had fractured in their minds, yet they clung to disbelief. The house, immaculate as ever, betrayed no hint of horror. Inside, however, death lay still in every room, silent and absolute. Detective Charles Eckert arrived after a call from a concerned neighbor. He walked up the stone pathway, noting the neat lawn and carefully trimmed hedges. It was the kind of house a family might leave for a vacation. But the air was different. It carried a weight, a stillness that was almost palpable, pressing against his chest as he approached the front door. He knocked. Silence. Twice more. Then, with permission, the door creaked open. Narration highlighted the first glimpse inside. The house was eerily untouched. A thin layer of dust shimmered in the sunlight that slanted through drawn blinds. Chairs remained in place, cutlery on the table, yet the emptiness was unsettling. The faint scent of stale coffee and cleaning products lingered, masking something darker beneath. "Hello? Anyone home?" Eckert called out, his voice echoing through the halls. No answer came. Only the tick of the grandfather clock, too loud in the unnatural silence. He moved from room to room. Then, in the study, the letters he had left behind, the carefully crafted alibis, caught his eye. Bank notifications, school excuses, letters to employers. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance. But something, in their neat arrangement, their sterile perfection, made his stomach tighten. The dining room told another story. Coffee cups sat in small pools of congealed liquid. Chairs were knocked over slightly as if moved in a hurry. Eckert's eyes caught a folded sleeping bag in the corner. Cautiously, he approached. Narration heightened the horror. Within the folds, he discovered Helen's body first. Then, as he looked around, he realized the grim reality. Each family member had been placed methodically, laid out in what John List had imagined as reverent order. Silence dominated. No struggle remained, no evidence of last moments beyond the stillness. Neighbors gathered outside as police secured the perimeter. The word spread quickly. The List family, gone. Shock rippled through Westfield. How could the perfect family vanish? The house, still pristine, was a contradiction, a crime scene frozen in time. One neighbor whispered to another, "It's like they're asleep. But why?" Dialogue captured the disbelief and fear. Another muttered, Who could do this?" Narration returned to Eckert. He noted every detail, every small object left in place. He understood that this was more than murder. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. The quietness, the order, the absence of any forced entry or struggle outside John List himself, painted a chilling portrait of methodical cruelty. As dusk fell, the shadows stretched across the empty rooms. The house felt alive with echoes, whispers of laughter, cries of children, and the long, agonizing silence of death. Each step he took, each photograph taken, each note recorded would linger in the minds of investigators and neighbors alike for years. The mansion, once a symbol of stability, now carried only echoes. And beyond its walls, John List walked free, a phantom in the suburban streets, leaving behind a scene that would haunt Westfield forever. The narrative closed in tension, setting up the next chapter. The man himself, untraceable, whose face would later be revealed through forensic art, the chapter of The Man with No Face, was ready to begin. John List vanished from Westfield, New Jersey, with the meticulousness that had defined his crimes. To the outside world, he had simply disappeared. The house remained intact, the streets quiet, and the neighbors unaware that the perfect family had been obliterated. But John himself was already forging a new identity, a man without face, without past, without connections. Narration lingered on his transformation. He dyed his hair, altered his voice, and adopted minor facial reconstructive surgery that left him nearly unrecognizable. A gray suit replaced the clothes of a suburban father. A small briefcase carried only essentials and false documents. Each detail of his new persona had been rehearsed countless times, ensuring that anyone who glimpsed him would see only a stranger. He moved quietly between towns, renting small rooms in motels, taking temporary work as a bookkeeper, the skills from his old life still useful. He avoided attention, never lingering in one place long enough for recognition. His solitude was both a punishment and a comfort. No neighbors, no family, no friends, just him and the careful maintenance of a new life. In his rented apartment, he spoke aloud occasionally, though no one answered. "God has guided me," he whispered, voice low, eyes tracing the edge of a tattered Bible. "No one can harm us now. They are safe in heaven." The narration reflected the obsessive clarity of his mind. John List believed his actions were not only justified, but righteous. Years in hiding reinforced his delusions, sharpening his discipline and further isolating him from the world. Every routine, every habit, every moment was devoted to preserving anonymity. Description painted the setting. Cramped motel rooms with flickering fluorescent lights, streets empty of familiar faces, the low hum of traffic like a distant reminder of a world he could no longer inhabit. His meals were simple, his interactions minimal, and his appearance meticulously maintained. Each day was a careful rehearsal in invisibility. Even when local townsfolk crossed his path, he became the man who belonged to no one. A barista, a clerk, a passerby, none could connect him to Westfield. His voice was softer, cautious. His eyes avoided the gaze of others, scanning exits, counting doors, memorizing escape routes. Dialogue occasionally broke the isolation. At a small diner, a waitress asked, "New in town?" John smiled faintly, measured. "Just passing through." Her nod was polite but distracted. No curiosity lingered. It was exactly as he had planned. Every interaction brief, every identity untraceable, every detail a shield. Narration returned to the psychological toll. Years alone allowed him to reflect, obsess, and plan. Though free from immediate pursuit, he was never at ease. Shadows of Westfield haunted him, the family, the house, the neighbors. In quiet moments, he recalled his children, his wife, and his mother, remembering their faces not as victims, but as redeemed souls. He read the obituaries of acquaintances, checking for his own presence in news columns, scanning newspapers for the faintest hint that his existence was known. Each omission reinforced his belief in his invisibility, in the perfection of his vanishing act. Yet even in isolation, the world encroached. He was meticulous, yes, but not infallible. Postal mistakes, a misfiled payment, a fleeting recognition, small cracks threatened the armor he had built. John's vigilance became obsessive. Every interaction, every phone call, every signature was weighed, considered, analyzed. In his apartment, alone, he whispered one final vow for the day. "I am unseen. I am safe. I am the man with no face." The narration closed in tension. He had survived for years, evading the law, the neighbors, and even his own past. But the cracks in anonymity had begun to form. The stage was set for the inevitable unraveling. The next chapter, the unraveling, would reveal the moment when careful planning collided with chance, when a life built on invisibility began to collapse. John List sat in the courtroom, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the polished wood before him. He had been caught, unmasked, and the weight of the law now pressed upon him. a tangible force heavier than any he had felt in years of hiding. For the first time, the carefully constructed anonymity that had shielded him was gone. Outside, reporters and cameras swarmed, a world of scrutiny he had meticulously evaded for decades. Narration captured the gravity. Justice had arrived, but redemption did not. John's mind remained a labyrinth of justification and delusion. He believed his actions had been necessary, divine, righteous. The jury, the public, the victims' families, none mattered in the landscape he had created for himself. He had acted as he believed God commanded, and no earthly sentence could alter that perception. The prosecution detailed the meticulously planned murders, the letters, the alibis, the careful cleaning, and the painstaking vanishing act. Witnesses testified, neighbors described the eerie silence that had shrouded the List home, and investigators recounted every chilling discovery inside the mansion. One detective recounted, voice steady but tense. It was a perfect suburban home, but inside, it was a mausoleum. Every detail planned, every action calculated. He had erased his family as though preparing for an altar. John's gaze remained impassive. To him, the words were facts stripped of emotion, like numbers in a ledger. He neither denied nor acknowledged the horror. His lawyer's voice rose, pleading for leniency, citing mental instability and religious obsession. But John's own statements echoed in the courtroom. "I did what I had to do," he said quietly. "I saved them from a world that would have corrupted their souls. I acted in faith." The jury listened, faces tight with disbelief and shock. Outside the courthouse, crowds murmured, some shaking their heads in horror, others in disbelief that a man could orchestrate such methodical cruelty. Narration painted the psychological aftermath. John List had achieved a strange immortality through fear and meticulous planning. His crimes were immortalized in newspapers, in police files, in the haunted memories of Westfield. And yet, he felt no remorse. The world saw horror. He saw obedience, duty, salvation. The sentence was read: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. John List would never walk free again. The law had rendered justice, but in his mind, the scales of cosmic judgment had not yet shifted. He remained steadfast in his conviction, unrepentant, immune to pity or despair. Inside the prison walls, John settled into routines reminiscent of his life in hiding. He maintained order, read scripture daily, and reflected on what he believed had been a necessary act. Guards noted his meticulous habits, the calmness of a man who had long been accustomed to isolation and control. Dialogue occurred rarely, brief exchanges with a chaplain or guard. "Do you regret it?" a chaplain asked quietly one afternoon. John's eyes met the ceiling, unblinking. "Regret? No. Only sorrow that the world does not understand what I have done." Narration emphasized the emptiness of redemption. He was punished by law, but not by conscience. His family gone, his freedom taken, he remained steadfast in the belief that their souls had been spared. There was no reconciliation, no emotional closure, only the cold certainty of justice administered on earth. Description lingered on the small details of his confinement: a narrow cell, steel bars, the faint echo of footsteps in the corridor, the dim light of the fluorescent lamp above his bunk. The walls were silent witnesses to a man who had taken lives in the name of faith, yet found no true penance within himself. Outside, Westfield slowly healed. The neighbors returned to routines. The lawn was mowed. Children played again. But the mansion remained empty, a permanent monument to horror. The echoes of that day, the quiet of death meticulously planned, lingered in memory long after John List was captured. The chapter closed on the finality of justice, but the absence of redemption. John List had been held accountable, yet he carried within him a conviction untouched by remorse, a chilling reminder that punishment does not always cleanse the soul, nor erase the darkness.